Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at the water cycle, also called the hydrologic cycle. And we see that the water is, if you see water, there's lots of water that you can see. There's lots of water in the ocean. There's lots of water in lakes and rivers. There is a lot of water that you cannot see. There's water that's in the air. The air is full of water. There's water that's in the ground. The ground is full of water. There's water that's inside the cells of living things, plants and animals and people. So if you were to take the water that in 1 year cycles through the environment, it would fill the earth, completely cover the earth 3 feet deep. Just the water. Now, that's not all the water that's in the world. There's water in the oceans that doesn't evaporate. There's water that doesn't go up into the air and come back down as rain. But the water that does cycle is enormous. And that water that's cycling, that rain that's falling, that's forming streams and rivers, that flowing water that's based on the water cycle is the main reason why the earth is shaped the way it is. So we're going to look at the different parts of it today. In kindergarten, you probably learned evaporation, condensation, precipitation. Those are the three main parts of the water cycle. You're going to see that there's lots more. And if you're going to call something a cycle, then it's going to be moving from one type to another. It's going to be converting. So the hydrologic cycle hydrology is the study of water, the Earth's water systems. So where is the water? That's, I guess, basically the question. And the water is all over the place. Water on Earth is stored in the oceans. It's stored in solid ice in the Arctic and Antarctic. It's stored in lakes and rivers. It's inside the ground. It's also inside living things. So you're going to see also that it's in the air. It's in clouds. It's in the air that's forming clouds. It's in falling water in the form of rain and snow from the air to the ground. So that is all in a cycle where essentially the energy from the sun allows this to move and move and move. So the idea of these arrows are showing that there is a cycle. And there are the large arrows that you see, but also some small arrows that you should see. So there's various cycles inside this large idea of moving water. The sun is what's causing the energy for all of this. So most of the water that comes up into the air is coming up into the air, of course, because of the sun. The sun warms the air. Warm air can hold lots and lots of water. And then the water, mostly from the ocean, is coming up into the air. So once it's in the air, it can condense into clouds. It condenses back into liquid. Once it is in the form of clouds, you have liquid water hanging out inside the air. It becomes too heavy and it will fall. The air can no longer hold it if there's lots and lots of water in it, so it will fall, and that's precipitation. Once it falls, then it can move towards wherever the lowest area is, and that is the idea of runoff. So runoff is what we think of as rivers, streams, smaller and larger moving water. So when the air is warmed from the sun and the water is warmed, there is enough energy in those molecules of water to escape the air pressure, and it goes up into the air and becomes water vapor, and that's called evaporation. So the air can hold a tremendous amount of water. The warmer the air, the more water it can hold. So when you have warm air, you can have, let's say in the summer, you can have lots of water. So it's very moist in the summer. If you have cold air, like in the winter, it doesn't hold very much moisture. And most people will even have effects on their skin, like their lips will chap, or your hands will chap, or your elbows will chap, because there's not enough moisture in the air to keep your skin hydrated. Okay, so you'll end up with a lower amount of water. You also realize that when the sun comes up in the morning, all the dew that's on the grass evaporates into the air because it holds it. But when the sun goes down and the temperature drops, that extra water that was stored in the warm air, as the air cools, will come back out of the air, and that's what dew is. When the temperature's low enough, it's frost. Okay, so evaporation is when it comes into the air, and that's based upon air temperature. Also, you have a lot of moisture that's lost by plants. If you were just to have a garden or a field of grass, you're going to have a tremendous amount of water that's lost just to the atmosphere. When the air is warm and dry, water will come right out of the plants and into the air. That's called transpiration. That's why that you have to have a constant supply of groundwater for those plants to be sucking up through the roots, because they just transpire so much. So a regular field, let's say a farmer's field of wheat or whatever, could lose 2 feet, that whole field covered in water 2 feet deep in one growing season. If you were to have a forest, it would be 4 feet deep. The amount of water that is pulling out of the ground and then coming up into the air from the leaves every single day, it's essentially wilting and then resupplying its water through its roots. That's called transpiration. So together, there's a big fancy 15-syllable word, evapotranspiration, which just means the water that's coming from groundwater or from plants that comes back up into the air due to the heat of the air. Now, when it rains or when it snows, that's called precipitation. Precipitation means falling out. So you have essentially a liquid that's dissolved in a gas. So you have liquid water that's dissolved in a gas, and it can't hold very much. It can hold a little bit, but it can't hold very much. And if you have too much water, it will fall as rain. So the more evaporation happens, the more the air fills up with water. Once it can't hold anymore and reaches a saturation point, it will start precipitating. That precipitation is instantly soaked up by the ground, because the ground can absorb a lot of water. If the amount of water absorbed by the ground isn't enough for the rain, then the rest of it is called runoff. And runoff will simply groundwater on top of the ground that's trying to make its way to a stream. All right, so you've got, as runoff starts, it has tiny little sheets across the hill, and then they form very teeny little tiny streams, okay, called a rill. A rill is a tiny, tiny little stream. A slightly larger stream, and so some of these streams can be the size of your finger. A little bit bigger would be called a gully, and the gullies are headed to what we would call a creek or a stream. Okay, so as it's coming together, a creek would be, a foot across or bigger, and then eventually you would call that stream a river. And a river normally has more than one supply channel, so more than one gully is coming into it, more than one stream is coming into a river. And then rivers can form river systems, where lots of rivers will form into huge, long, wide, slow-moving rivers to eventually to some body of water, usually the ocean. So the steeper it is, the faster the water moves. The flatter it is, the less steep it is, the slower it will move. A drainage basin is an entire section of land that will eventually be emptied by one river. So as you have, let's say, a hillside, and you've got lots of rills forming lots and lots of gullies, forming lots of streams, all those streams could eventually come into a river. That drainage river is draining that whole system, and that's called a drainage basin. Now, you could have lots of little streams coming off of one mountain, but if you were to have essentially the way that the topography of it, you would end up with water falling anywhere on that side of the hill will eventually go to a river. That's a drainage system. Now, a divide is a ridge on top of a hill in such a way that a drop of water on one side of that ridge would go into one river system, and a drop of water on the other would go to a different river system. So the Eastern Continental Divide, which is just past West Virginia in Maryland, any drop of water that's east of that line would go into the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, it would form in usually Chesapeake Bay, depends on where it is, and then into the Atlantic Ocean. An inch to the west of that, and it would eventually make its way into the Mississippi River and down into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's called a divide. And there are two major divides in America. There's the Eastern Continental Divide and the Western. And that the Western, don't know exactly where it is. I know it's in the Rockies. So anything to the left of the Rockies would make it into the Pacific Ocean. Anything to the east of the Rocky Mountains would eventually make its way into the Mississippi River again and drain off.